pleasure to welcome everybody here for today's program, a panel discussion of Dennis Klein's book, Survivor Transitional Narratives of Nazi-Era Destruction, the Second Liberation. And so the format that we're going to be following today is three-part. I am going to introduce all of our panelists at the beginning. We're going to give each panelist about 7-8 minutes to offer some remarks and to make connections perhaps to their own research or their fields as it applies. And then we are going to have an opportunity for our panelists to engage in dialogue with one another. And we will close with a chance for some questions. So if nobody has any questions right now, we're going to get started. Our first panelist today will be Dr. Christine Thorpe, who is the Dean of the Nathan Weiss Graduate College at Kean University. She is a certified wellness coach and health education specialist with more than 20 years experience in higher ed and the human service fields. Her interests and recent publications focus on women's health, health disparities, historical traumas, holistic nutrition, motivational interviewing, and health literacy. And among other things and roles that she holds, she is the author of Living Beyond the Facade, Inside the Health and Wealth Practices of Americans of African Descent. Our second speaker will be Dr. Michael Rotenberg Schwartz. He is an associate professor of English and the chair of the English department at New Jersey City University. And there, among other things, he teaches a course on literature of genocide. He's been a participant in Holocaust seminars hosted by the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, which I've been really lucky to participate in that with him, as well as the summer program at the Holocaust Educational Foundation. He has published an article on Art Spiegelman's 𝑵𝒂𝒂𝒏𝒂𝒕𝒊𝒐𝒏. More broadly, he has written about the representation of war and peace and the entanglement of war, trade, and poetics in British literature. Currently, he's in the early stages of developing a community-engaged learning course on transitional justice after mass atrocity. And our third panelist is Michael Carter. And Michael is an adjunct professor in history at Kean University, and he is a graduate of the Masters of Arts in Holocaust and Genocide Studies program. He considers himself an Americanist genocide scholar who focuses on the destruction of Native American nations as well as other instances of ethnic violence. Broadly, he works with genocide as a historical phenomenon and genocide recognition as a form of transitional justice. He is currently working on research projects, including a book on genocidal eugenic-based sterilization abuse. So I'm now going to open things up. Dr. Thorpe, if you'd like to begin.
Thank you, Dr. Goldberg. Thank you to my fellow panelists and all of the guests, students, faculty, staff, and other attendees. It's a pleasure to be here and to have the opportunity to discuss this tremendous, tremendous book. Dr. Klein, I will tell you that this book was riveting and drew me in a lot of directions as I read. And considering the work that I have done, looking at historical traumas and drawing parallels with the book, Surviving Transitional Narratives of the Nazi-Era Destruction, it moved me in many different ways. And I wanted to talk about some of the pieces that were really impactful in the reading and review of this such important text. And I looked at it, essentially at all the pieces that were coming together and considered the past and present memories of the relationships that the Jews during the time considered and the impact of those memories of those relationships and their ability to reconcile with the feelings of shame surrounding their trust and what the book noted as their compatriots. And, reflecting on those feelings of shame and gave me pause to consider, where that shame came from and reading further to understand the betrayal that resulted in a number of conflicted feelings And what was noted in the book that really moved me, the last to be aware of the circumstances or how to evaluate anti-Semitism. And, you know, looking at it from that lens helped me to understand that this was a time that was unfolding as a segment of the population was living through it and trying to make sense of what's really happening in relation to their neighbors who, up until that time, had a community. And the betrayal that existed as a result of the Nazi era challenged the community, the Jewish community, and their feelings and their hurt, which was very much, you know, just very painful as I read. And I wanted to tie in a quote that really moved me by Richard Vernon, the remark on page 59, "Some wrongs endure, however, in an embodied way, that is, in the bodies and minds of those who still suffer them despite distance in time from the original wrong." That quote stuck with me because in reading and thinking about ancestral versus social memories, and one might think the distance from the Holocaust to the 60s, that things should be forgotten and let bygones be bygones, but not truly dissecting the pain, the shame, the emotions, the betrayal, and the conflicted feelings in trying to make sense of the world that they were living in, and having those voices, those stories told in their voices in a way that truly reflected them and not what was being projected upon them as the Jewish community. And I've often thought about that in my reading, in akin to at the turn of the 20th century, in some of my own work, looking at some of the slave narratives that came out of the South and how journalists would go South and interview some of the last living people from who went through slavery in this deep South in America, and telling their story of what they felt and the pain and what life was like after 1865, and how even being so-called free did not result necessarily in freedom, and not knowing where to turn in terms of where home was, when home became a place of even more conflict, and having folks flee from the South north, trying to find a place where they can find a reconciliation from their past. It caused me to think about a lot of these things and draw some parallels, definitely giving deference and respect to each experience in each community, and understanding that the possibilities, as I was reading through Jean Emery, between conflicted resentment and possibilities leads to skepticism, and the constant feeling that, is this society truly going to recognize what we've been through, whether it's through the Holocaust or any other other experience, and be able to understand and connect and realize that this was truly an atrocity. And further along, as I read through the additional chapters, really, took notice at the connections of betrayal and what it led to, betrayal leading to resentment, betrayal seen as criminal, something that was noted on page 99 of 𝑵𝒂𝒏𝒔𝒏𝒂𝒕𝒊𝒐𝒏, and betrayal as a transitional emotion to see and experience the world through a different lens. And that was something I definitely wanted to delve into more and understand a little bit more deeply, what that means in a new lens, and how does one navigate the world going forward. And the whole concept of forgiveness, I really appreciated the connection between the Truth and Reconciliation experience in South Africa, and recognizing the pressure put on a victim to forgive and have compassion. I noted that as, that's significant. And that pressure, is it for whose benefit ultimately? And once that happens, is it meant to be a forgive and forget and move on like nothing happened? Or is this an opportunity for both sides to move through and build forward in a healthier connection? So understanding that forgiveness as a gift is something that we, can't take for granted, I'm going to stop there, because that gift of forgiveness is not something that we just hand out freely, and especially experiencing such an atrocity, to recognize that experience, the lived experience and the memories of those experiences that live on through what was noted as ancestral and social memories, impacts how we interface with each other and the world today. And to understand that intersection between betrayal and forgiveness, how do we get to that place of what I'm reading in the final chapter, finality? What does that look like? What is that next step supposed to be in our shared spaces and our histories that live on and must live on for us to learn and do better as human beings in society? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think that the topic of betrayal and forgiveness is certainly one that I hope our panelists will be able to discuss after your remarks. And now I turn to Dr. Rotenberg Schwartz.
I want to start by thanking Adara, Dr. Goldberg, for inviting me to participate in the conversation today, since it's not often I get to speak with people who share an interest in the Holocaust and transitional justice after genocide. I'll start by saying I appreciated very much the moments when Dr. Klein's book touched on 18th century thought. 18th century British literature is my primary area of expertise, and for years I've thought about ways to connect it to my interest in genocide studies. My research has taken me into a range of topics, from theories of war and peace in the era to the representation of graphic violence and the limits and ethics thereof. But never have I considered thinking about what the 18th century had to say about transitional justice, in particular about resentment and forgiveness. The truth is, I'm not sure I've thought very much about resentment and forgiveness in relation to the Holocaust at all. And scanning the indexes of the relevant scholarly books I have near to hand, so not in my office at school though, unfortunately, I don't think many readers of Holocaust literature have either. I was looking at Alvin Rosenfield's book, Susan Gubar's book. It's not in the index. The 18th century is very much on my mind now because I spent the last few days zooming into the annual conference of the American Society of 18th Century Studies. I'll share that many conversations were had, mostly doubtful, on the value and relevance of Enlightenment thinking to contemporary issues of social justice. This is, of course, because of the contradiction between slavery and colonial exploitation in the East Indies and the espousal of rights in documents like the Declaration of Independence. Dr. Klein refers to Lynn Hunt at one point, but Hunt's confidence in novelistic sympathy has been answered by Nicole Wright's 2020 book, Defending Privilege, which shows that many conservative British novelists deployed readerly sympathy in defense of established hierarchy and even against humanitarian intervention. Fellow feeling is something that emerges by the latter part of the 18th century, but for Joseph Butler, resentment and forgiveness were neither democratically available, only elites had the status to resent and could condescend to forgive, nor about connecting on an emotional level. Forgiveness for Butler is motivated by self-interest. Compassion, on the other hand, is other-directed, and loyalty to the social contract. Because of this, it's possible for someone to forgive, but also retain indignation. Adam Smith has interesting things to say in the theory of moral sentiments about resentment. It's crucial for sensing injustice, but also inescapable as a potential disruptor of the spontaneous orders he loves and needs occasional support of an invisible hand. I think here we get a little closer to Dr. Klein's notion that moving forward must allow for lingering resentment. But if we really want to trace current thinking about forgiveness and transitional justice, that for it to be authentic requires a personal experience originating in pure and disinterested love for a person's essence. To anyone in the 18th century, it should be Rousseau, as Karen Pagani thoroughly shows in her 2016 book, Man or Citizen. Believing anger should not be the privilege of the aristocracy, but available to any virtuous citizen when justice is miscarried, Rousseau considered resentment crucial for a functioning society, but more problematic in the private realm. I wonder what digging more into the genealogy of these concepts might produce with regard to how transitional justice can and ought to work today. It was interesting as an English professor to sense Dr. Klein's discomfort with seemingly contradictory moments in texts, where several decades ago, literary critics would search for resolutions to textual inconsistencies. Today, there's more comfort with irresolution. But as I've just suggested by referring to 18th century thinkers, I think texts that let anger and forgiveness coexist are not necessarily unstable. I understand Dr. Klein's skepticism about counter-memory and working through. I love how he throws postmodern in there as though it's some kind of an epithet. But I've been persuaded, and I didn't know he was going to be here, by Henry Greenspan, for one, that each retelling of the past offers something new to the listener and teller alike. So I'd actually love to hear about how the attitudes of Wiesenthal and Jankelevich changed over time. If we get interpretations here of their transitional texts, I wonder what might be said of their pre-transitional text or their post-transitional narratives, if there are any. Anne-Marie has, of course, committed suicide. I also found the use of Bloom striking because the anxiety of influence from which the book's idea of swerving is derived is all about a poet's Freudian relationship with a precursor poet, the need to get out from under the shadow by rejecting the father. Given that the theory is intertextual, I wonder what precursor texts are relevant for the writers here, or might be productive for readers to juxtapose regardless of the writer's knowledge. For example, how does thinking about the transitional justice narrative as a genre influence our understanding of texts written by formerly enslaved people? For example, as Anne-Marie is moved to write in response to the Auschwitz trials, so too in his interesting narrative, Oluda Equiano is motivated to establish the ability of any Black man to speak for himself in a public, legal way. Moving forward, how might these moving forward in time, thinking about how these texts might themselves cast anxiety of influence, how might these transitional narratives be seen as casting a shadow over testimonials in Rwanda, Bosnia, and other later mass atrocities? It's particularly interesting to me that the three writers chosen were secular Jews. What can be said about non-acculturated Jews who might draw on the Bible or halakha to frame their past, or who understood themselves in relation to pogrom and crusader piyutim, liturgical poetry? If these people didn't feel at home in the first place, the feeling of betrayal expressed in their narratives should be different. This would be fascinating to hear about. If the Auschwitz trials goaded people into addressing the public, it would be good to hear the range of responses beyond these three writers. I'll return to this point in a moment, but I want to linger on the idea of betrayal as a concept, which I found really provocative, especially since the concept was, after all, not unidirectional, with the Nazis having deployed it in their own anti-Semitic propaganda, describing how the Jews stabbed Germany in the back during World War I. I wonder what other kinds of betrayal we might think about to deepen our understanding of the betrayal Dr. Klein explores. Take Paul Celan, whose poem Totenaberg, about his relationship with Heidegger, might allow us to think of betrayal in Bloomian anxiety. His poetry is all about the betrayal perpetrated by the German language itself. I'm not sure Celan senses a future, though he does work to break down and reinvent the language. Another kind of betrayal, the moment in If This Be a Man, when Alex, without hatred and without sneering, wipes his dirty hand on Levy's shoulder. When he wipes his dirty hand on Levy's shoulder, it leads Levy to end his chapter on the following note. Quote, "He would be amazed, the poor brute Alex, if someone told him today that on the basis of this action, I judge him and Panwitz and innumerable others like him, big and small, in Auschwitz and everywhere." This is betrayal directed towards fellow victims. I wonder if we find anywhere someone writing about betraying oneself. Yet another form of betrayal to consider might be found in second-generation texts, such as Spiegelman's Mouse, particularly the page in which Art accuses his father of killing his mother. for burning her diaries. How does the tension between resentment and forgiveness get passed down to the second generation? And finally, what about betrayal on the perpetrator's side? 𝑵𝒂𝒓𝒂𝒊𝒂𝒐𝒓, I'm not pronouncing her name correctly, I think, and I apologize for that. Her story of the daughter in the collection Stillness, about a young university student who commits suicide after learning her father was a perpetrator of war crimes. This is actually about the Bosnian genocide. My final questions actually have to do with the historicism of the book. The literary theory most relevant here would be reader response criticism. We hear a little about why these writers were spurred to write, but less about how they were reviewed and responded to. I found this absence problematic because in thinking about transitional justice, we of course must consider everyone involved: victims, perpetrators, and bystanders. I also wonder how other trials or public events shaped later Holocaust writing. For example, what happened to accounts, say, in the wake of the John Demjanjuk trial, when witnesses started to seem dubious because of aging and distance in time? Did seeing the witness as someone whose memory was failing and therefore suspicious spark any new generic moves? I'd be very interested to hear about how forgiveness and resentment have been treated in writing since the 60s. I didn't have a chance to pursue this, but a quick look at the 𝑬𝒓𝒄𝒏𝒔𝒏 database revealed 775 hits for forgiveness and 711 for resentment. I hope it's clear that I find Dr. Klein's book remarkably generative. I look forward to seeing how other scholars pick up where he's left off.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And now I'm going to invite Michael Carter. Please start speaking.
Mildly terrified, because I also didn't realize until starting the Zoom call that Dr. Klein was going to be here. First of all, I want to apologize for the earlier technical issues and leaving amid Dr. Thorpe's talk to fix my camera. I missed a chunk of that, and for that, I wanted to apologize. I absolutely love this book for a couple of reasons. One, because I feel like that I saw it being put together in real time. I had the chance during my graduate time at Kean to really see Dr. Klein wrestle in the classroom with transitional justice, with memory, probing questions that most of the time I did not have answers to. He was the one that introduced me to transitional justice in my first class, in my first semester as a graduate student. And I haven't really shaken, nor should I, many of the lessons and the conversations that have come out of that, including the criticism of many tactics of transitional justice, very similar language you find in the text itself. So it was almost like going back to class with Dr. Klein, and that's always something I appreciate. Something else Dr. Klein very well knows is I almost make a hobby of crowbarring comparative genocide into every place I could possibly put it, particularly in the Americanist sense. I consider myself an Americanist genocide scholar, and as my introduction says, particularly with Native Americans. And I found myself always thinking in that comparative sense as I was reading through the book, always, I guess, lighting up a little bit when I see mentions of other historical analogies, a traitor within the ranks of Herman Cortez, a mention of ISIS, the mention of South African apartheid, although of course when you're talking transitional justice you expect apartheid to come up. So that just had me think about it even more in that comparative, broader historical lens. But still, of course, Holocaust studies is the core of genocide studies. That's a completely different conversation about paradigm. But it just has this massive, broad appeal that I could find it. I probably do have to read it 2 or 3 more times to pull everything else that I would like to get out of it. I was fascinated by, even as a subtitle, the concept of the 1960s as a second liberation. The difference between, or rather the contrast between literal liberation from the various sites across Europe or rather, or even broader, literal liberation from the experience of being under the shadow of Nazi destruction, to having to push back and protest against a world that is apathetic or perhaps disinterested in what occurred in the mid 20th century in exchange for trading fighting fascists with fighting Soviets. So I found that having potentially incredible value to the discussion. I look forward to working with that even more. But I was particularly drawn, like some of my other fellow panelists, to chapter 4, to betrayal, to the feelings of and sensitivity to betrayal. There is a line that Dr. Klein writes on page 103, a sentence says, once betrayed, they were aware that they had to renegotiate relationships with a world that demonstrated hostile intentions. And it's unimaginable. Your own community, your neighbors, perhaps even members of your family, depending on how the ethnic religious relationship of the broader family was, turned on you. And then you're asked after the fact in some capacity to return to that world. You have different neighbors, but you're still concerned. There are still daggers in every shadow. And it did a great job of putting together that conflict between looking at the past, at the literal atrocities, the literal horror, at the betrayal, and then negotiating that in some shape or form with the desire to move forward, with the desire to rejoin broader human society. And to that same degree, when considering betrayal, this last Saturday, I was at an online conference through the University of Mississippi where I put together a paper on the Osage, who were a Oklahoma indigenous group in Osage County. And during the early 20th, during the 1920s, they were the victims of a multitude of serial murders. It's hooked into the origin story of the FBI. There was a recent book by David Grann on it, Popular History. I presented that in terms of a genocide studies lens due to the goal of wiping out the tribal people to get at their oil wealth. And as I was reading and rereading chapter 4 and putting these remarks together, I couldn't help but constantly relate back to that research. One of the rare instances of, let's say indigenous or Native American relationship with the United States, where you literally have more of a pogrom style response, where you literally have a community ripped asunder rather than two worlds clashing with one another. I'll finish up my remarks because I've actually clearly gone off what I've prepared. I also enjoyed the going after the failings of transitional justice, or perhaps the limits of transitional justice, the potential devaluing of survivor testimony, the devaluing of written survivor testimony, perhaps even oral survivor testimony as primary sources in the broader scheme. And I did enjoy the quote by 𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂, the Colombian human rights activist and UN Special Rapporteur, who talks about not just recognizing the individual, the atrocity, but rather the individual. Not getting lost in the weeds of the broader events that we talk about, be it the Holocaust, be it indigenous violence, be it the institution of slavery, finding the individual within that and extract from it the actual human memory. And as I said, I am looking forward to rereading this piece again and again and using it deeply when I have the chance to. And I will forego the rest of my remaining time for our discussion periods. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, everybody, for your remarks. A few points that I would like to raise that I heard come up was really the themes of betrayal and forgiveness, living in discomfort alongside each other, the issue of perspective and what voice is, and the fact that all three of the poets the writers who were focused on were secular Jewish males. And I wonder if there are comparable figures whose narratives, whose writings could be drawn upon, who perhaps are non-Jews, are women, are members of other populations that may have been impacted. And of course, that's something that leads to another book entirely. There's only so much that can be covered in a single book, but I'd be curious to think about what that text might look like, and whether there are comparable voices or writers or leaders in your respective fields who have disquieted in their own way. So those are just a few of the things that came up. And one other point that I'd like to mention for myself that I didn't know when I began reading this book last spring, when we had originally considered running the panel in person, was some of the parallels and differences between these cases and the Canadian case of disquieting amongst Holocaust survivors in the 1960s, with the public emergence and rise of survivor voices, not only as a survivor voice and part of the community, but part of the broader Jewish community, and really shaking things up in terms of the way that the Holocaust was to be remembered and was to be memorialized within Canadian society. And it makes me think, of Frank Bialystok's Delayed Impact. But in a sense, how very different, those figures were, because whereas these are three known writers, known figures, that case really looked more so at ordinary civilians whose stories would rarely go beyond that community if they had not been immortalized in writing. And so perhaps, Dennis, I don't know if there's anything that you'd like to say or any questions that you have for the panelists to get our conversation going.
Yeah, well, I do. And largely because all of you are raising really pretty key questions here. And it's in that sense, Christine, I noted that you were making a special note of the reference I make to the final act, or to finality. And I left that incomplete, partly because this is really a work in progress still for me, and partly because I think it's a work in progress for witnesses. So in a sense, there really is no finality to this process that we're talking about. So I just wanted to comment a bit on what all of you are saying, and I really do appreciate the close reading that you've done, and some really thoughtful remarks. Let me first of all pick up on what Adara you just said. This would have been a book 3 times the size, at least, if I were to include these other perspectives that we're referring to. So I decided to focus on 3 Jewish males. And why was I doing that? Partly because something Jewish about them is part of the story that I needed to bring out, so that we can talk about, right, Michael Carter, the indigenous, which is itself an important story, as we know, and so many other, right, the slave narratives, Christine, that you're referring to, really are considerable to take into account. But as an historian, I don't stick only with the text. I need to put some context around it. And context makes a difference with regard to these particular memoirs that we're talking about. The context for Jews in Germany 20 years after the Holocaust is really very considerable, because, as some of you referred to, ancestral memories is part of the story here. For Jews, as I suspect we all know, their expectation from the Enlightenment forward was to be welcomed into and to start belonging to the larger societies in which they were residing. They had aspirations. It's a big controversy historically of whether or not those aspirations were mythical, but nonetheless, Jews had a great deal of hope or expectation. So that the Holocaust occurred, and as so many witnesses then observe, they felt abandoned by neighbors that they had come to expect so much help from. That's where betrayal enters the story. Betrayal therefore means that those expectations were violated. it also means, as I think that all of you are referring to this point, that though they were violated, memories nonetheless play a vital role here, because they had once expected and therefore were beginning to wonder whether they can still expect some kind of relationship to their neighbors or compatriots. It certainly, as they were the first to declare, can't be the same kind of relationship that they had expected at one time in their history. But nonetheless, a connection. And so that's what I think I mean by not bringing this to a close. Because witnesses, though they yearn for that reconnection, themselves don't know what it looks like. And all that we can really detect is their recognition of abandonment during this period of the Holocaust, and their nostalgia, although I don't think that's the right term here, for something more than abandonment in the legacy that they now had to learn to live with. So there is something complicated here. That's why I don't really believe the word reconciliation is the right term. I really don't believe they ever expect to reconcile differences with their now enemies. But I think the term came up, and I think Michael Carter, I think you raised this term, and Christine, I think you referred to this as well. I think the word negotiation is a much better term here for what survivors expect from this new world for themselves, and I believe they believed for the world at large. Negotiation means, on the one hand, that this is a world that they've inherited that is no longer trustworthy. Any innocence that existed prior to the Holocaust has vanished. So that they keep before them suspicion and vigilance as primary frame of mind. It's primary for them. But it doesn't mean that they've given up on forming a new relationship with these very neighbors. And so they're holding two, and I think that all of you have mentioned this point. They're holding two memories in conflict. And I appreciate Michael, we got a few Michaels here, but I appreciate Michael Rotenberg Schwartz's references that in the text itself, there is irresolution. And I appreciate that comment and that observation, because though you and I search for and seek reconciliation in our own lives or order, the truth is that certainly after atrocity, it remains unresolved. That's what we inherit, I think, from these witness testimonies, that the world is complicated. We need to be both vigilant and aspirational at the same time. And that requires negotiation. That requires a constant negotiation between those who have been harmed and those who had harmed them. Just one other observation I want to make, and then I would like to open this up. Betrayal doesn't work for everyone. You have to have a prehistory of relationships, or at least imagined relationships. So I'm not too sure that Blacks who emerged from slavery had any expectations whatsoever from the white world in which they now were participating in, and we know how fraught that was. So it's not clear to me, though I appreciate the comparisons, whether this would be a point of comparison. I'd be interested in response to that. Also, I think Michael, and again, this is Michael Rotenberg Schwartz, Germans certainly felt, I guess we can say, betrayed by Jews, a stab in the back legend. But Germans never had faith in a relationship with Jews. That prehistory with Jews was really, I mean, of course, there are important exceptions here, in even period of times when there was a greater formative relationship between Germans and Jews. But it's nothing in comparison with what Jews expected, on the other hand, from Germans. So I think we have to be a bit careful about some of these comparisons in order to make this point. And Michael Carter, that would, I imagine, hold true as well for you and your research, that the relationship between the indigenous in the United States, right, and the larger nation in which they resided was never on solid ground. So that their expectations for something better, I think, is incomplete. And probably, I think, face a much harder road forward. That would be my observations. It's a hard road forward for everyone, but I think those differences are important to note. So I'll just leave it there for the moment.
Thank you very much. And now I'd love to welcome our panelists to perhaps turn your mics back on, and to see if you have any responses to Dr. Klein or to one another's papers.
Thank you, Dara. I guess my response would be true. You know, betrayal may not be something that one might want to associate with what happened with historically with slavery and enslaved Africans here, unless you go back and have a conversation about perhaps at the very beginning, when you're looking at indentured servitude for a very, very small window. When that switched over, there were no more promises, but there was hope for better. And that hope was what was drawn on for survival, which is hard throughout a 246-year history of enslavement. But the going back and even looking at the Middle Passage experience and prior to that, and the conflicts that happened on the continent of Africa, and the movement of bodies. You know, Michael, you're leaning in and your mouth is opening. I feel like you want to say something to me.
No, not to you. I want to add.
Okay, go ahead and add. Because I'm a watcher and I can see it like I'm in a classroom. So I'm like, is there somebody who wants to speak? Go ahead.
Well, I mean, on slavery, first of all, those Africans who were converted, and many of them were converted in Africa, like in Central Africa, they were converted already a couple centuries before the mid-18th and 19th century. They certainly could have felt betrayed as Christians, and that's certainly in the rhetoric of early anti-slavery poetry. The idea of we're the true Christians, you're the false Christians, you're the black at heart, we're the pure and white, etc. And they do sense a deferral of we'll be restored in heaven one day, but that doesn't mean they're giving up on today, and that they wouldn't have felt a betrayal on that level. Besides,
there was also the betrayal, and if I can jump on that, the betrayal with the belief that you learn our language, you will become one of us. So when you become a French colony, you become a British colony, you are, whether you're, oh goodness, my mind is slipping on the term, but are you one of us truly, or are you, in tandem to us as a community? Michael, you're leaning in. Sorry, Adara, like I said, I see faces and I respond.
No, it's just, that's a perfect jumping off point for me to respond to what Dr. Klein had said. I chose my wording, or at least I thought I did, fairly carefully when I made the indigenous comparison with the book's material. I used the Osage particularly because they had a reservation integrated society with the white community. And I would say, unless you are, for example, a indigenous group that learned a language, learned English, set up your own language, wore European clothing, held slaves, lived in European style housing. I'm talking about Cherokee and similar tribes of that era who were, the first, you could probably argue the first organized death march in American history. So I would say, but yes, you are technically correct. If we looked at the broader sense of, Indian wars and stuff like that, there is no betrayal there necessarily. You're talking about a colonial imperial conflict. It's completely different. But I think there may be a few instances contextually within different tribes where there might still be the betrayal aspect.
I would say sorry. I got it, because I wanted to finish this off before anyway.
Go ahead, Michael, because I'm like, yeah, go ahead.
Whereas enslaved people might have felt they were betrayed on the level of, hey, we're Christians and why are we being treated this way? That's not the deal. On the other hand, Native Americans By the way, another way that someone like 𝑵𝒂𝒛𝒊 can be upset is on this level of, hey, it's the Enlightenment. And here you are talking about this idea of rights, but what's up, right? Where's the rights? So that's a betrayal on another level. And keeping on that idea of legality, when you want to talk about indigenous, Native American tribes, there were all sorts of early contracts established, right? The colonials and the tribes.
Yes.
And those were broken. And that's in many, many, many early accounts by indigenous people. We made a deal and you gave us trinkets, you gave us alcohol, you gave us
Right.
what you promised.
You gave us blankets with smallpox.
I'm not saying it's the same thing. I'm really not.
Yeah.
But, I think that we can find interesting
parallels. I think we don't want to put one in a bucket as completely separatist from the other, and which is why we've been able to draw interesting parallels from the reading to other historical atrocities that remind us of experiences that significantly whole groups of people have and continue today live with in the context of that lived history, a parallel. And I guess that's why I was so curious about what's the next step, because when I look at both the indigenous communities and the histories there and the communities of African descent here, the big question continues to be what's next? Where is there a reparation? Where is there the next thing? We look to South Africa for truth and reconciliation, but we still don't feel like that has even happened, much less a recognition that you sit on land that was not yours. And you now charge us for living on that land. And you put us on the worst possible land, send us the worst food. So I look at the historical trauma in terms of public health and the impact that it's had, particularly on women, that now has played out in the chronic illnesses that we see across both the Native American indigenous community and the Black community in this country. And those historical traumas that continue to play out and relive themselves. And that's why that the statement of ancestral versus social memories are very real, because when we talk about how these things are manifested in our sensibilities, in our bodies, in our minds from generation to generation, where I've had students say, yes, as a result of my grandparents, my parents manifested these illnesses and I manifested them too, because it was because of the atrocities that they experienced during the Holocaust. And to hear that and have research that supports, yes, these traumas impact you. We need to recognize that these this is research and this is work that can be translated across other groups and used to further substantiate with strength an understanding of how these histories, as documented, as more documented that we see with the Holocaust and the Jewish history that we see, where can we extrapolate and learn about how to further document what's seen in other communities that don't have that level of documentation, to further highlight the pain and the reality that's happening today. So where do we go from here? How do we, negotiate the next steps on Earth in a healthy way? Because what we're seeing today is still many levels of things played out, things that we know about and what's not even spoken that continue.
I have a question on the German context. I think my point was, on the stabbing in the back thing. I mean, I agree with you, and that's what I'm saying. Well, I guess my question is this: why did people believe it? I mean, I know we've asked that question before. Like, how could the German Jews not have seen it? Pierre von Passen wrote a book published in America a good 7 or 8 years, earlier than the Wannsee Conference, saying, "Watch that guy Hitler. He is bad news." So, what weren't they recognizing? Germany didn't have buy-in, Wagner, et cetera. Why did these communities, why would they have felt betrayed exactly? And again, and are we, here you're sort of defining a genre, but it seems like you're also making it a really narrow genre in a way, because if we can't extend it, if we're only sticking to like these Germans, and I wonder how many are we accounting for then? Like, what's the percentage of the population? So then when it comes to the Jews in Poland or Hungary, Ukraine, Romania, does this not apply to them just at all? Or are there ways in which this genre that you're defining we can think about it in relation to those people. That's my question in a way about, Jews are not the same everywhere. Of course not now, not ever. And so they have different attachments to the land or the nation, the culture that they're in. And so that feeling of betrayal, I think there's a wide possible range here. And I'd just love to hear more about it is all.
Yeah, so let me jump back in if I could. Dara, is that okay okay, good. Yeah, no, these are great. These are great questions, I think, what you're asking. And Kristen, I do want to come back to your next step. What's the next step? That's an important question for sure. But the, first of all, I think comparative material, comparative study is a good next step, academically speaking. And in fact, I am leading a seminar, some of you may know, that's funded by the NEH in the end of June, that's entitled The Search for Humanity After Atrocity. And it really is, right, it will bring, we've already selected our participants, folks from very different, looking at very different circumstances to do exactly what I think you're all raising here, about how do we then extend some of the implications, narrow or otherwise, of this particular book. So I applaud the reference to comparative work. And I hope that this becomes a springboard for just the kind of questions that all of us are raising. I do want to say that, Christine, coming back to your point about that narrow window of indentured servitude, and I would add to that, that with the Great Migration in the 20th century, there really was, again, a narrow window where whites and blacks were really joining hands in the labor disputes that were taking place during that period of time. It quickly fell apart after a couple of years, I imagine. I don't know exactly how long it lasted, but there was this moment, I guess, in history of some form of, I don't know if it's reconciliation, but a sense of an alliance. And some people argue that during the civil rights era in the 50s and 60s, there was also an alliance that had taken place. So the question, and I can only ask the question, is whether these moments in the history between blacks and white Americans is exceptional, the exception, or is there something deeper? And here I just have to leave it as a question in the psychology and memory of blacks about whether these episodes suggest that there's a chance, that there is a relationship that's fundamental to the American story for blacks, for Black Americans, and that therefore betrayal, if that's what it is, may well actually be and I don't know the answer to that question. I think requires, this kind of inquiry to begin to determine whether in fact there is a sense that yes, fundamentally, we do belong in this nation, we do belong to this nation, and therefore we can expect something more than what has been largely delivered. And I just don't know the answer to that question, but I think it's the comparative question at the heart of it. And as I say, I applaud that very, very much. In terms of, well, I also wanted to mention, Michael, that yes, what about enlarging the picture? I guess I'm referring to that at this moment, to Polish Jews, for example, and to not only Jews, but to others as well. And all that I was really trying to accomplish in this one project, this book, was to highlight the role of betrayal in the question of transitional narratives, that it works in some cases, it may not be in fact a hinge moment or a transition in other circumstances. But certainly in the case study that I decided to write about, it played a considerable role in the way that survivors themselves were beginning to understand their legacy or the legacy of the Holocaust. And just one last point about, therefore, coming back, Christine, to your point, where do we go from here? And the best answer, and here I rely on what survivors tell us, we all may have our hope and opinion, but what survivors tell us is that we must move forward. And that in itself, I think, is an important message, They haven't given up. They haven't lost hope. My God, anybody going through the experience that they went through and described so graphically in their memoirs, it's hard to imagine that there is, in fact, room for moving forward. And you're quite right, Michael. Jean-Henri did commit suicide about 12, 13 years after he wrote At the Mind's Limits in the mid-60s. And so maybe that step forward is tentative and even on fragile ground. It's quite possible. But certainly what he was writing in the mid-60s, and I do want to quote real briefly of what he says in his original preface. I sometimes hope that this study could concern all those who wish to live together as fellow human beings. It's there in his work. He was just more explicit about it in his preference. There's something that's urgent. He uses a word urgent at one or 2 points in his narrative, where he felt that it was significant to move forward. But how that looks, I believe the suggestion of survivors is that that's up to you and to me. I think that's where they want to leave it. They're leaving it to citizen activism, to each of us taking the next step to gather forward. If we believe, as survivors did, that there must be a step forward, that's up to us. That's how we must create that opportunity. They don't want to tell us what that is. I don't think they knew themselves. That we need to move forward is clear, but how we do that is something they are leaving up to us.
Excellent, thank you. And I just saw in the chat, Hank Greenspan, you wrote something. Would you like to say it out loud? You were cited earlier.
That's what I meant, so that I didn't expect him to be here.
I'll say it out loud. I'm wearing a baseball hat, so I'm going to keep my head covered, not for religious reasons. Yeah, no, I'll just read what I wrote. I was thinking, first of all, I enjoy and appreciate the complexity of these issues as described, as Dennis has written. And I was just referencing the fact that many of the survivors that I've known well, and that's over almost 50 years now, say quite different things off the record, you know, when they're not, quote, giving testimony or writing memoirs than they may in that other context. And typically, among the people I know, they're much less sanguine about the possibility that their accounts, their experience will matter. Nonetheless, as I wrote, they continue to try. They go back to schools. They, not in every case, of course, but many. I think of 𝑵𝒂𝒏𝒔𝒏𝒂𝒕𝒊𝒐𝒏, what did he call it? Absurd moral daydream. That he wasn't expecting when he said it that they would lead anywhere. But these survivors, you know, it's sort of keep hope alive, essentially. So that's really all I was saying. And just a note on 𝑵𝒂𝒏𝒔𝒏𝒂𝒕𝒊𝒐𝒏 suicide, which is very complicated, but less so perhaps than Levy's. Less so than Levy's. There were all kinds of medical issues and so on. And Levy himself wrote about 𝑵𝒂𝒏𝒔𝒏𝒂 in a phrase that applies to probably every suicide, which is that they always admit every such suicide to a, quote, nebula, as the Italian, a cloud of explanation. So this notion that either one committed suicide out of despair related to the Holocaust is, again, almost certainly a great oversimplification. So we know that life is complex for survivors like everybody else. That's really all I say.
I hope I wasn't taken to be suggesting otherwise, by the way.
Okay, maybe I missed the point. Sorry.
No, just that that he didn't have further writings, right? We can't ask what his post-transitional writings were, if there were any, because his life ended.
Well, he wrote about suicide, and he wrote about aging.
I think he died at 5, and
I don't know if you know his book about aging.
Yes.
He wrote that aging is worse than Auschwitz, or it was, because you were more alone. I don't know if you're being an aged person myself. I'm not going to say that, but I perhaps understand it a little more than I did years ago when I reviewed that book. Anyway.
I mean, I really liked, we're talking about betrayal, but the truth is I really love the resentment part. And, because I teach torture and I teach resentment, powerful statements. And Don Pagis's poem, the extremely skeptical poem about reparations, and even an earlier text, but the fraudulent, the sort of fake found story of 𝑦𝒓𝒄𝒂, who speaks to God, right?
Yeah.
Where he's fantasizing about Nazis burning to death, and he loves, he stays true and loyal to the God of vengeance. I mean, that's what he says. I understand now what the Talmud means when God is called the God of vengeance. So that element in this story is very, very important. And that's what I meant by the 18th century stuff. The truth is, a lot of the thinkers don't say we need to purge. I mean, you say this too, Dennis, right? That resentment is not something to just put away, ignore it, erase it. They acknowledge it has to be part of the story. Rousseau advocates for resentment as necessary. So I think that's really, really, really important.
Great. Thank you.
And what I'd like now is to allow each of our panelists perhaps a final moment to share some closing thoughts, references, and then if there are any questions, and we'll wrap up in the next few minutes. So Dr. Thorpe, would you like to begin?
Sure thing. And I put in the chat, since we didn't get to address your question, Dr. Goldberg, just a couple of writers off the top of my head who I thought that their work would speak to particularly the Black experience. I was trying to think quickly of Native American writers who would be comparable for us to consider in talking about the lived experiences, the traumatization, and these are particularly women who talk about racism, sexism, the intersection of those, as well as the classism and other experiences that are lived today. I guess some of my final comments in trying to tie everything together. Again, this book really challenged me to think about the collections of experiences across groups and not putting one over or under another, but to understand contextually where they're placed and to see some commonalities that are drawn across them. And, particularly about the Black experience in America, the understanding that both the Black experience and the Indigenous experience through internal colonialism, living on the land of those who colonized you, and trying to move through that experience to where we are today and to make sense of how does one acculturate, how does one assimilate, how does one remain within their identity and still sit side by side with those who have oppressed you and continue to do so. And whether there is betrayal, when one thinks of civil rights movement and not, and see that these things have happened where we have now laws and movements and marches, thinking that here we are today, we shouldn't have such atrocious experiences, and we lived through one last year where everyone witnessed a murder. And it's almost as if, yet again, we have to remind you that we are human beings and not the animals you perceive us to be, during enslavement. So, I see this as an opportunity to really work through the pain that we're experiencing across a number of groups and learn from the experiences. How do we grapple with this and grapple with those who have been the ones to inflict the victimization and the pain, and see them side by side as another human being and be respected and have self-respect and have self-determination and actualization in a society that continues to battle and challenge your worth on a day-to-day basis. So I think that there's a lot that can be drawn from the whole concept of finality. And as you said, Dennis, it's open. It continues because we're still reliving and continue to relive pain and memories through re-traumatization of things that we've seen in real time. And how do we then build forward? And, there aren't 100% alliances between whites and Blacks. You'll have in any group, those who feel connected and you have those who don't. And some who were quietly, hiding their connectedness, and some who turned around and said, no, we won't support you because it just doesn't seem right. And, even among the Holocaust and the Jewish community, for folks who had people who were quiet allies and kept, quietly to themselves, but tried to do their part. There weren't many of those either. And they were outnumbered by the majority of people who said, no, I'm going to err on the side of what's prevailing and be part of the greater problem. And we still see that today. How do we have this crowd mentality and not be able to step back and say, wait a minute, this is not right. But moving forward is definitely something that has to be done in a way that is in its full truth and full understanding, and not with pieces left behind out of convenience. And as Michael Rotenberg said, the privilege of having, the experience of picking forgiveness or not, and serving in certain capacities. We need to be mindful of that. But this process of moving forward is a very delicate one for all involved.
Thank you. Michael Rotenberg Schwartz.
Well, really, I'm just going to confess to you what my plans are for myself. I mean, what I couldn't do today, I would have loved to respond in some ways about this, but it's my summer research plans. I've got a big stack of reading for this course on transitional justice that I'm working on for next year. And part of that reading involves getting into the Rwandan 𝒂𝒂 system, and also thinking about what's gone on in other tribunals, after Bosnia, that kind of thing. And those two cases in particular, although it's well-trodden territory in many ways, but those might be the most relevant in a way for this conversation, because this is a story where we are talking about friends and neighbors killing each other, right? Literally in both cases. So that's where betrayal, and how do you move on from there, and the need to move on from there, and the need to move on living next door still to those same people. I'd be very curious to see, I'm curious to see in what I've printed already, and then anything else I find, how has that been addressed? How did the systems try to deal with it? And what are personal accounts? What has been written to try to acknowledge that, either in terms of poetry or fiction or et cetera. So I couldn't talk about that today, but that is somewhere where I want to go. And the last thing I'll say is, I'm at New Jersey City University, so I hope I'm not a stranger. I'm happy to sort of be available for the community, because like I said, it's a really nice opportunity for me to get to talk to people with, shared interests. I don't necessarily have that at my home institution. So again, thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you for accepting the invitation. Thank you. And Michael Carter, we're going to close out with you.
Oh, I've been sitting here trying to think, as my other great panelists have put together their closing remarks, what I would say, where I could take it, if I could say anything better. And largely I can't. I love the book. I love this opportunity. Thank you for this opportunity. And as I continue with other research projects, I will always sort of keep this close by in some capacity or another, because I think, well, we got into a little bit of a debate over, I guess we can say, communal and political betrayal, and how, and where this could connect. I think there's something there, and I look forward to the fruits of Dr. Klein's labors. At the end of June, when you wrestle with this, and that's about it. I'm looking forward to where this goes. I'll leave it at that, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. And, really, thank you, Dennis, for writing the book. Thank you, Dr. Thorpe, Dr. Rotenberg Schwartz, Michael, for participating in today's panel and for really enlightening us, and not only on the book itself and your reflections, but the ways in which these critical themes apply to not only your work and your future work, but also other historical incidences of injustice. So thank you so much, and we look forward to working together soon. And everyone have a wonderful night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good night, everybody.
Take care, guys.